So, listeners, we've received some really interesting material recently, and I thought this would be a great topic for a deep dive.
Yeah, it looks really fascinating.
It's all about something called the Taxshila Model of Learnography. And from what I've read, it seems to propose a really different way of looking at how classrooms function,
Yeah.
or maybe sometimes how they don't function so well.
Yeah, and how we can improve them.
Yeah. So maybe we can start with, well, first of all, do you want to introduce yourself to the listeners real quick?
Sure, yeah. My name's Expert Name,
Yeah.
and I've been working in the education space for, I don't know, 10, 15 years.
Okay, great. And I'm host name, and I'm the host here. So yeah, the Taxshila model. One of the things that really jumped out at me from the material was this idea of like categorizing students, and it talks about problem makers and problem solvers.
Right.
So maybe you can you sort of unpack what those two categories look like in a classroom?
Sure, yeah. So problem makers
Mm.
are essentially the students who tend to create kind of disturbances in the classroom.
Okay.
So, they might be talking a lot when they're not supposed to be.
Oh,
They
yeah.
might be interrupting the teacher a lot,
Right.
or their fellow students. They might be resisting classroom rules
Yeah.
or avoiding their academic tasks. Um, and the source material also talks about even things like teasing and bullying,
Oh, wow.
which
Yeah.
could be a big distraction, obviously.
Yeah. It sounds like in a traditional classroom that really relies heavily on the teacher kind of being the center of attention and, trying to do this sort of passive learning thing
Right,
and, using disciplinary measures to try to keep everybody on track.
right.
It seems like the problem maker student can really,
Can really take up a lot of time
yeah.
and energy from the teacher and kind of take the focus away from learning.
Yeah. And the source material even mentions that specifically, like, the teacher's attention is being diverted away from
Right.
facilitating this knowledge transfer again. Right.
Which is really what they're there to do.
Exactly.
And just trying to maintain order in the classroom.
Exactly. And it can be really tiring for a teacher, obviously,
Yeah.
to be constantly putting out fires,
Right.
rather than actually teaching.
Right. So that's the problem maker.
Yeah.
So what about the problem solver student?
So the problem solver student is really the opposite.
Okay.
This is the student who is contributing to a good learning environment. They're willing to help other students with their tasks.
Okay.
They encourage teamwork
Mm-hmm.
and, sort of mutual learning
Okay.
among the students. They generally follow the rules and are respectful of the learning space.
Mm-hmm.
And importantly, they're really responsible for their own learning
Okay.
and engaged in what the model calls book-to-brain knowledge transfer.
Okay. So these are kind of like the ideal student
Right.
in a way. I mean, the ones that are really self-motivated.
And able to kind of move their own learning forward.
Exactly. And often they even help other students to do the same.
And the model even calls them model learners.
Model learners or small teachers.
Right? It's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah.
So we have this distinction between the problem maker student and the problem solver student.
Right.
So now the Taxshila model of learnography is presented as kind of the system to help problem makers become problem solvers.
Yeah.
So what are like the core ideas that are behind this transformation from one to the other?
Well, there are three main principles that the model is based on.
Okay.
The first one is what they call motor science and brain page development.
Motor science and brain page development. So the brain page idea we've talked about before on this deep dive.
Right.
But the motor science thing, that's kind of a new
That's a new wrinkle, yeah.
a new angle.
So basically what they're saying is that traditional classrooms really focus on cognitive engagement. So, sitting still and listening to the teacher or reading quietly to yourself.
Right.
But the Taxshila model points out that the brain actually learns really well through motor processing.
Oh, so like physical activity.
Yeah, through physical action.
Okay.
They specifically mention parts of the brain, like the substantia nigra and the basal ganglia,
Okay.
which are
Yep.
involved in movement, but also in transferring knowledge
Mm-hmm.
and learning efficiently, and even forming habits.
Okay.
So they're saying that, when you're physically engaged with the information, like when you're writing something down or drawing a picture or, manipulating objects or actually practicing a skill,
Mm-hmm.
you're much more likely to remember it later.
So it's not just about, sitting still and listening.
Yeah,
It's about
so-
actually doing things.
Right. And this is where it ties in with the problem makers,
Okay.
because the model suggests that maybe the reason they're disruptive is because they're not getting enough of this physical engagement
Okay.
that they need.
So they have all this energy and they need to be moving around and
Right, they need to be moving around and doing things.
yeah.
And so instead of trying to force them to be still and quiet, maybe we should be giving them activities that let them use that energy in a productive way.
Okay, so instead of saying, sit still and be quiet, it's here's a project for you to work on that's going to let you move around.
Right, exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. So that's the first principle. What about the second one?
The second principle is what they call miniature schools and self-directed learning.
Miniature schools. Okay.
So basically the idea is that you divide the class into smaller groups,
Okay.
kind of like little mini schools within the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And then the focus shifts to the students learning from each other
Okay.
and taking more responsibility for their own learning.
So it's less about the teacher being the source of all knowledge
Right.
and more about the students kind of working together
Right.
and learning from each other.
Exactly. And this can be really helpful for problem makers.
Okay, how so?
Well, first of all, it gives them a sense of responsibility.
Okay.
They have a specific role to play within their mini school,
Okay.
and they're accountable to their peers
Mm-hmm.
for doing their part.
Right.
And second, it gives them a chance to actually lead.
Okay.
They might be the one who's explaining a concept to the other students in their group
Right.
or helping them with a task.
So you're kind of taking this energy that they have that might otherwise be disruptive and
Yeah.
channeling it into a leadership role.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the second principle. What about the third one?
So the third principle is, it's a mouthful. It's called the Gyanpeeth Experience and knowledge transfer.
Gyanpeeth Experience.
Yeah. And basically what this principle is all about is making learning more like real-world problem solving.
Okay.
So the source material makes this analogy to learning a practical skill, like riding a bike or playing an instrument.
Okay.
You don't learn those things by just sitting and listening to someone talk about them.
Right.
You have to actually get out there and do it.
Right.
You have to practice. You have to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
You have to get feedback and adjust.
Yeah, you learn by doing.
Exactly. You learn by doing.
Yeah.
And so the Gyanpeeth Experience is about creating that kind of learning environment in the classroom.
So less abstract theory and more hands-on practical stuff.
Right. More hands-on stuff, more real-world application.
Okay.
And this can be especially helpful for problem makers
Yeah.
who might have trouble sitting still and listening to a lecture.
Right.
But if you give them a problem to solve or a project to work on,
Mm-hmm.
they're much more likely to be engaged.
Okay, so we have these three principles. Modi science, miniature schools, and this Gyanpeeth experience.
Right.
How do they actually work together to transform a problem maker into a problem solver?
So the Taxshila model describes this transformation as happening in 3 stages.
Okay.
The first stage is called identification and engagement. And the key here is that you're not looking at problem makers as just troublemakers.
Okay.
You're looking at them as students who maybe just aren't getting their needs met
Okay.
in the traditional classroom.
Right, so it's not a moral failing, it's just a different way of
Right. It's a different way of learning.
learning. Yeah.
Yeah. So instead of punishing them, you try to figure out what they need.
Oh, okay.
And then you give them activities that meet those needs.
So if they need to move around more, you give them something that lets them move around more.
Exactly.
Okay.
The second stage is called peer learning and miniature schools.
Okay.
And this is where those miniature schools that we talked about really come into play.
Right.
So the students are divided into these smaller groups, and they're working together to learn the material.
Okay.
And the problem makers are learning from the model learners
Right.
in their group.
The small teachers.
Small teachers, right.
Yeah.
And there's this specific method that they use called the Teach Me method, which is basically just having the students explain the concepts to each other.
Okay.
And it turns out that this is a really effective way to learn.
Why is that?
Well, when you have to explain something to somebody else,
Mm-hmm.
you have to really understand it yourself.
Right.
You can't just kind of memorize the facts.
Yeah.
You have to actually process them and make sense of them.
Yeah.
And so the problem makers are getting this deeper understanding of the material
Okay.
by teaching it to their peers.
And they're also getting the benefit of seeing it from a different perspective.
Right, because their peers might have a different way of understanding it
Yeah.
than the teacher does.
Yeah. So everybody's kind of learning from everybody.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the second stage. What about the third one?
The third stage is called knowledge flow and Gyanpeeth Experience.
Knowledge flow. Okay.
And this is where the students really start to see the benefits of all this hard work they've been doing.
Okay.
They're starting to understand the material more deeply. They're starting to be able to apply it to real-world problems.
Okay.
And they're starting to feel a sense of accomplishment.
So that's where that Gyanpeeth experience comes in.
Right. The Gyanpeeth Experience is all about applying knowledge to real-world problems.
Okay.
So the students are getting a chance to use what they've learned to do something practical.
Okay.
And this is really motivating for them because they can see how their knowledge is actually useful.
Right. It's not just abstract theory anymore.
Exactly.
It's something that they can actually use.
Right. And so as the students progress through these 3 stages, they're gradually transforming from problem makers to problem solvers.
Okay.
They're developing better learning habits.
Mm-hmm.
They're becoming more engaged in the classroom.
Okay.
And they're starting to thrive.
So this whole idea of a happiness classroom.
Right.
It's not just about, making the classroom a fun place to be.
Right.
It's about this deeper transformation that's happening within the students.
Exactly. It's about them feeling good about themselves and their ability to learn.
So the happiness comes from the inside out.
Exactly.
It's not something that's imposed from the outside.
Right.
It's something that they develop themselves.
Exactly.
Okay, so the Taxshila model seems to offer a really different way of looking at classroom management.
Yeah.
And really focusing on, not just managing behavior, but actually transforming students.
Right. It's about helping them to become better learners.
Right.
Not just better behaved.
And this whole focus on brain page development, it's about empowering students to really master knowledge.
Right.
Not just memorize facts.
I do that.
So it's a pretty ambitious goal.
It is.
But it seems like it has a lot of potential.
Yeah, I think so too.
So I'm curious to know what our listeners think.
Yeah, me too.
So if you're out there and you're listening, have you ever had any experience with the Taxshila model?
Yeah. Have you seen anything like this in action?
Or maybe even if you haven't specifically seen the Taxshila model, have you seen other approaches that kind of take this same idea of, engaging motor skills and peer learning and the sort of practical application of knowledge?
Right.
We'd love to hear from you. So you can leave a comment on the website, or you can send us an email, or you can tweet at us.
Whatever works for you.
Yeah. And if you want to learn more about the Taxshila model,
Right.
the source material mentions something called the Taxshila page.
Yeah, you can Google that.
Yeah, so you can Google that and see what you can find.
Yeah.
And we'll be back next week with another deep dive into some other fascinating topic.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks for joining me.
It was fun.
All right, see you later.